Hey guys, tonight we drift back to Harlem, back when the streets buzzed not just with music and life, but with something heavier. Picture Lenox Avenue in the late 1960s. Neon signs sputter like tired stars. Jazz leaks from the second-floor windows. And under all that rhythm, there's a new pulse forming, smoother than jazz, darker than midnight, and worth more than most could ever dream of. Frank Lucas stands near the corner in a camel hair coat that costs more than the car parked beside him. He's watching. Not the girls, not the cars. He's watching opportunity. In the shadows of America's war in Vietnam, a door opened halfway across the world. But Harlem? Harlem was the real battlefield. And Frank? He was about to redraw its lines, quietly, methodically, and with a plan that you probably wouldn't survive more than a week inside. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. He didn't look like a man about to import heroin by the kilo. No gold chains, no booming laugh. Frank Lucas moved like Harlem's air, thick, slow, necessary. His eyes, always 2 seconds ahead, tracked who owed what, who whispered too loud, and which soldier was ready to defect. Frank wasn't born in Harlem. He arrived there from North Carolina, dragging behind him poverty like a second shadow. His first few months, petty jobs, small-time hustles, and wide eyes. The city didn't welcome him. It tolerated him. Harlem in the 50s didn't need another poor Southern kid, but it got one anyway. And this one paid attention. Historical fact. Bumpy Johnson was Harlem's gentleman gangster, ruling uptown with a blend of charm, smarts, and just enough violence to keep folks honest. Frank didn't just admire him, he studied him, watched how Bumpy tipped bellhops, how he shut down a room just by walking in. And more importantly, Frank noted who shut up when Bumpy entered. Respect had weight. It's said that Frank first caught Bumpy's attention while handling errands, shoe shines, packages, maybe the occasional whispered favor. Many people still think that Bumpy saw in Frank a reflection of his younger self. So, what do you think? Was it mentorship or grooming? At night, Frank would lean against the wall near 116th, counting passing Cadillacs, memorizing license plates. His mind never idled. Behind every glittery storefront, he saw the bones of the real Harlem. Not the music clubs, but the cash laundries. Not the bars, but the corner runners. And above all, he saw heroin creeping in like a fog, dressed in junkie sweat and whispers. By 1968, the U.S. military had been deep in Vietnam for years, but Harlem had its own kind of war. And unlike in the jungles of Saigon, this one wasn't televised. It unfolded in alleyways, tenement hallways, and mothers' sighs. Frank didn't cause that war, but he absolutely chose to capitalize on it. The thing was, Frank Lucas didn't want to be a gangster, not the way Hollywood showed them. He wanted to be bigger, not noisy like the Italians downtown, not flashy like uptown pimps. He wanted the power without the theater, the throne without the spotlight. He'd later say that middlemen were the enemy. "Why pay more," he told a confidant, "when I can go to the source?" And that idea, simple as it sounded, would end up reshaping the narcotics trade in ways no one predicted. He watched Harlem as if it were a machine with visible gears, each addict a cog, each dollar a lever. And somewhere between the sirens and the soul music, Frank began to sketch the blueprint of something terrifyingly efficient. One night, in late autumn, he sat in a barbershop chair, nodding along to the hum of clippers, when a soldier home from Vietnam started rambling about how easy it was to get drugs overseas, how dirt cheap heroin was in places like Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. Frank barely spoke, but he listened like a man taking notes inside his head. Remember that? That moment, scissors snipping, a soldier talking loosely, and Frank saying almost nothing. That was the spark. That's when the Saigon to Harlem pipeline began, even if no one realized it yet. That's also when Frank started to fade from visibility. Just a little. He stopped lingering on corners. He started asking better questions. He was no longer just watching Harlem. He was seeing through it. He understood something most didn't, that Harlem didn't need more product. It needed better product, cleaner, stronger, branded, a luxury drug for a broken neighborhood. And if he could get it for cheap, sell it for less, and keep it purer, he wouldn't just rule Harlem, he'd rewire it. Frank Lucas doesn't walk into a room so much as arrive. He doesn't wear his ambition on his sleeve. He keeps it tucked beneath silk and wool. And when Bumpy Johnson is around, Frank's presence softens, not from fear, but reverence. You don't get to be Bumpy's right hand by being loud. You get there by shutting up, showing up, and doing exactly what needs to be done, without asking why. There's this story, maybe true, maybe Harlem legend, about Frank in a crisp fur coat holding Bumpy's umbrella during a light rain. No words exchanged, no instructions given, just understanding. And in that simple act, you can already see the blueprint forming. Loyalty first, discretion second, image third. Frank becomes more than just an errand boy. He absorbs Bumpy's mannerisms the way a sponge drinks up whiskey. He watches how Bumpy never orders anyone twice, how he controls entire rooms by adjusting his cufflinks, how the mere clearing of his throat rearranges conversations. Harlem respects Bumpy because Bumpy never begs for respect. He walks in already draped in it. Historical footnote? Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. He was a complex figure who read Shakespeare in prison and kept a close relationship with civil rights leaders. He represented a paradox, ruthless and educated, violent and charismatic. To Frank, he wasn't just a mentor. He was proof that power could come with polish. And Frank? Frank polished himself to a mirror shine. He started dressing different. Not flashy, but sharp. Understated luxury, the kind of suits that whisper instead of shout. He watched Bumpy's business model too. Control the product, own the street, but don't ever, ever let the Italians think you need them. Frank filed that away like a prayer. Soon, Frank's responsibilities grow. He's collecting money, enforcing rules, smoothing out deals. Bumpy trusts him more than most, maybe more than anyone. And while the older man still runs the game, he starts leaning heavier on Frank, quietly, predictably. That's when Harlem starts to notice the kid with the eyes like winter mornings and the walk of a man who already knows how the story ends. He's still Bumpy's shadow, yes, but shadows stretch when the light starts shifting. Many people still think that Bumpy planned for Frank to take over. So what do you think? Was it a natural handoff or an accidental inheritance? Then, one morning in 1968, Frank gets the call. Bumpy Johnson collapses in a diner, right there in front of his eggs and black coffee. Heart attack. By the time the sirens echo down the avenue, it's already too late. The king is dead. And Harlem? Harlem trembles. The structure starts to shake. Bumpy had kept order. He'd been the unofficial mayor of Harlem's underbelly. His death isn't just a loss, it's an invitation. The vultures come fast. New dealers try to carve slices out of a city not yet cold. Chaos brews in alleyways, rivalries flare. And into this vacuum steps Frank Lucas, not with a roar, but with a smirk. At Bumpy's funeral, Frank stands still. He doesn't cry. He doesn't fidget. He watches, sees who shows up, who stays away, who makes promises, who avoids eye contact. It's not grief. It's reconnaissance, and almost no one notices that within a week, Frank starts quietly acquiring Bumpy's old connections, not demanding them, not threatening, just picking up the phone with the right tone of voice. He doesn't claim the throne. He lets people offer it. That's the difference. Frank doesn't need to shout. He's not a street corner preacher. He's a boardroom strategist in crocodile shoes. And the plan he begins forming now is one that will turn Harlem into a kingdom, not ruled by bullets, but by purity. See? The heroin hitting the streets then? It's garbage, cut with sugar, talc, or worse. Addicts are getting sick. Some are overdosing on weak product just because they have to use more to feel anything. Frank sees an opening. An obvious, brilliant, dangerous one. What if he could bring in heroin that's unstepped on? 99% pure. A product that sells itself. Not because of force, but because of demand. No middlemen, no mafia taxes. Just him and the source. The idea of branding heroin like Coca-Cola would horrify most. But Frank? He smiles at the thought. And late at night, he starts thinking again about that soldier from Vietnam, the one talking too loosely about the cheap, raw heroin moving through Southeast Asia. Frank doesn't just remember the story. He remembers the details, the towns, the routes, the soldiers willing to move anything if the price was right. He begins mapping it in his head, from jungle to airfield, from airfield to military base, from Coffin to Harlem. The math checks out. The risk? Astronomical. But the reward? Generational. He doesn't tell anyone yet. Not his brothers. Not his wife. Not even his most trusted lieutenants. But in his silence, the plan sharpens. And Harlem, already teetering from Bumpy's absence, is about to get a new ghost. Not loud, not flashy, just terrifyingly effective. The morning Bumpy Johnson dies, Harlem doesn't explode. It twitches, like a muscle that's forgotten how to relax. And Frank Lucas feels it in the pavement. The heartbeat of the street changes, slower, louder, less predictable. He watches the people move, slower than usual, more cautious. The storefronts look the same, but behind the glass, there's unease, because no one knows who's in charge anymore. Frank doesn't step into the spotlight. That's not his way. He doesn't call meetings or make speeches. Instead, he walks the streets, like always. Same coat, same hat, but with an air that's heavier, like he's carrying something he hasn't yet unpacked. He's not mourning Bumpy like the others. He's calculating. There's a power vacuum now. The Italians smell it. The cops know it. The other Harlem players? They start jostling, throwing elbows, scrambling to scoop up what Bumpy left behind. And most of them look right past Frank. Too quiet, they think. Too polite. They're not watching closely enough, because Frank's already moving. First, he stabilizes Bumpy's old operations, pays off the right people, reassures the anxious ones, steps in when a lieutenant stumbles. Always calm, always measured. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't flash a weapon. But when Frank tells someone to sit down, they sit. The real trick? Frank doesn't try to become bumpy. He becomes something new. He starts carving his own brand of control. More business, less theater, fewer suits at the club, more ledgers in the back office. He builds a team of cousins, brothers, in-laws, people who won't flip because family doesn't snitch easy. At least that's the hope. And all the while, one plan simmers in the back of his mind, like water just shy of boiling. The pipeline from Vietnam. Historical fact. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War had created a perfect storm for drug smuggling. With tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers rotating through Southeast Asia, entire logistics systems had been co-opted for illicit trade. Weapons in, drugs out. And among the chaos, a quiet few figured out how to make obscene profits. Frank hears more stories. From more veterans. Some intentional. Some drunken slips. They talk about Golden Triangle heroin, purer than anything stateside. They talk about local chemists, jungle labs, and shipping routes that dodge customs like whispers in the wind. The geography starts to take shape in Frank's mind. Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, northern Vietnam, and Saigon. Many people still think that Frank went to Asia alone. So what do you think? Was he the architect or the courier? Either way, he books a ticket. And just like that, the man who barely finished elementary school is suddenly stepping off a plane in a city filled with soldiers, spies, and side deals. Saigon is humid, loud, layered with dust and secrets. Frank doesn't speak the language. He doesn't need to. Money, as always, is fluent everywhere. He moves cautiously. Doesn't ask questions he shouldn't. Doesn't flash cash until he's sure where to place it. But soon enough, he finds the contact he needs. A cousin of a cousin, stationed at an airbase, bored out of his mind, looking to make some real money before shipping back to the Bronx. This man introduces Frank to someone higher, then someone higher still. And before long, Frank is sitting under a corrugated metal roof somewhere near the Mekong River, sipping tea across from a man who could order his execution with a twitch of his eyebrow. This is where Frank shines. He doesn't beg. He doesn't bluff. He presents the deal like a businessman selling insurance. He can move their product directly to a major U.S. market. He can pay in cash. He can protect the pipeline. He's not greedy, just consistent. They like that. And in return, they offer him heroin so pure it makes your teeth tingle just holding the bag. The kind of stuff that dealers back in Harlem would weep to get their hands on. Now comes the hard part, getting it back. Frank doesn't want mules. Too risky. He doesn't trust pilots. Too visible. And then, somewhere in the chaos of Saigon, he hears about the coffins. American military coffins, sealed, untouchable, sacred in a bureaucratic kind of way. No one wants to be the guy who opens one of those for inspection. And Frank doesn't say yes. He says, "Show me." The operation he witnesses isn't slick. It's gritty, rough-edged, improvised, but it works. Small wooden compartments inside casket linings, heroin wrapped in plastic, nestled among sandbags or under flag-draped lids. No one checks. No one questions. Frank watches, then nods. Back in Harlem, no one has a clue. They're still arguing over who controls which corners. Meanwhile, Frank is laying the foundation for a distribution network they can't even imagine. One that stretches from Saigon jungle labs to funeral homes in the Bronx. And he still hasn't told anyone. It's the silence that makes it work. Frank returns from Vietnam different. Not flashy different. Loaded different. He doesn't say where he's been. He doesn't have to. The money starts appearing. Quietly. Regularly. And the heroin? It's blue. The color alone becomes legend. Addicts call it blue magic. Dealers start whispering about it in hallways, asking for it in code. It's strong, clean, uncut. Frank doesn't even have to market it. His competitors do it for him by watering down their own supply just to keep up. Frank Lucas, the quiet apprentice, has just opened the first transcontinental heroin pipeline between Southeast Asia and Harlem. And no one, not the Italians, not the cops, not even his closest allies, knows just how he pulled it off. By the time people start noticing something's off, it's already too late. The heroin hitting Harlem is too good, too clean, and it's moving in too much volume to be local. People whisper theories. Maybe the Italians are making a push-up town. Maybe someone robbed a federal warehouse. Maybe Bumpy had one last stash that Frank found in a wall somewhere. But none of those guesses stick. None of them explain why addicts are lining up for one specific brand, blue magic. It hits soft but deep, doesn't burn, doesn't clot, and it gets you so far gone, people swear they hear music even in total silence. Frank never planned on naming it. That part came from the streets. But once the name caught on, he embraced it like a Wall Street CEO rolling out a new product line. He even started packaging it. Glassine bags, clean folds, logo stamped. It wasn't just dope anymore. It was a brand, and in a neighborhood where trust was scarce, branding meant something. Blue magic becomes a kind of promise. This won't kill you as fast, won't make you blind, won't send you into convulsions on a subway bench. It's a twisted sort of consumer confidence, but confidence nonetheless. Frank's competitors? They're scrambling. Some try to mimic the bags, others try to bribe his people. One even tries to undercut his price, but addicts keep coming back to blue magic, like it's gospel. The genius is in the math. Most heroin on the street is 10 to 20% pure, cut with sugar, baking soda, flour, chalk, you name it. Frank's version? Over 90%. He can sell less for less and still make more. It's the kind of formula that makes economists both horrified and impressed. Historical fact? At its peak, blue magic was reportedly netting Frank over $1 million per day. And that was just what was counted. He buys houses in Teaneck, cars with bulletproof panels, a ranch in North Carolina with horses and sun-drenched porches. But what he really buys is silence. Judges, cops, politicians, funeral home workers, even airport staff. Everyone gets a piece of the quiet. Still, many people still think Frank wasn't running it himself, that someone else had to be behind it. So, what do you think? Could one man really orchestrate that kind of operation in the open? If you ask Frank, he'll tell you it was simple. No middlemen, just product, pipeline, and family. He starts recruiting his cousins, uncles, brothers, men with no drug records, no known affiliations, no flashy habits. He teaches them to dress like bankers, to speak softly, to keep their heads down. Some carry suitcases, others sign leases under fake names. One opens a small dry cleaning business that never once sees a customer walk through the door. Frank controls every step, from Saigon to the block, from coffin to corner. And that kind of control, it makes him both invincible and invisible, for a time. But power likes to be noticed, even when the man holding it doesn't. And it's around this point that Frank makes a mistake, not with drugs, not with money, but with fur. It's the 1971 Muhammad Ali-Joe Frazier fight at Madison Square Garden. The kind of event that draws kings, queens, mob bosses, movie stars, and presidents, sometimes all at once. Frank arrives late, takes a seat ringside, and pulls his coat tighter against the air. It's chinchilla. Real. Heavy. Handmade. The kind of coat that costs as much as a house. And under it, a custom-made hatband with $25,000 in cash tucked in tight. Frank usually doesn't dress like this. Usually he's all about subtlety, tone, clean lines. But tonight he steps out, and the flashbulbs catch him. Detective Richie Roberts, sitting a few rows back, leans into his partner and mutters, "Who the hell is that?" The coat becomes legend. In the days that follow, Richie starts pulling threads. Arrest records, real estate purchases, business licenses tied to distant cousins. Slowly, the shape of something bigger starts to form. A network, a pattern, a name that keeps surfacing. Frank Lucas, back in Harlem. Frank doesn't notice the heat at first. Business is booming. He's diversified. Investments in gas stations, clubs, a few record labels. He even donates to a local church and quietly sponsors scholarships for neighborhood kids. To the untrained eye, he's just another successful businessman with Southern charm and a mysterious supply chain. But the streets are talking. And now, so is law enforcement. It's not just Richie. The DEA is interested. The IRS, too. Even the CIA gets wind of a heroin route possibly tied to military infrastructure overseas. Frank's network was built to be airtight, but nothing stays secret forever. And Frank? He starts to sense the shift. His people start getting nervous. One cousin gets pulled over twice in 1 week. A stash house goes missing. A funeral home director suddenly retires and disappears to the Bahamas. So Frank does what he always does. He tightens the leash, stops talking in open spaces, moves meetings to basements, switches suppliers in Saigon, changes the colors of the bags, the stickers, the cut pattern. Paranoia becomes part of the operating manual. But even with the walls closing in, blue magic still flows. The product never misses a beat. And Harlem? Harlem still lines up. Because when you build your empire on addiction, you don't need loyalty. You just need the right need. You've probably heard it before. Don't get high on your own supply. Frank Lucas didn't. That wasn't his weakness. His was different. He trusted silence a little too much. The coffin route, as the feds would later call it, didn't look like a smuggling operation. That was the genius. No planes flying low, no suitcases taped with bricks, just uniformed military personnel escorting caskets, sacred, heavy, untouchable. And inside some of those caskets, beneath the flags, tucked into false bottoms or lining the wood panels, lay bricks of heroin pure enough to restart the pulse of a dying street economy. But Frank didn't just rely on the death flights. He layered his roots. Some came in through diplomatic pouches, some through hollowed-out furniture. Some, yes, through the same funeral homes that buried Harlem's best hustlers and worst fathers. Each route came with its own lie, and behind each lie, a man Frank had vetted personally. Most of them were family. Some were close enough to pass as such. All of them knew the deal. Loyalty meant wealth. Disloyalty meant, well, no one ever really found out what happened to disloyalty under Frank. One of his cousins once said, "We didn't call it crime. We called it moving weight. And weight, when moved right, changed everything." Historical fact? At its peak, Frank's heroin ring was so efficient that dealers in Harlem stopped buying from the mafia entirely. For the first time in decades, black-owned distribution dominated the market without needing permission from downtown. That alone rattled more boardrooms than bullets ever could. But Frank didn't just want money, he wanted autonomy. He knew how the Italians operated. Loud respect, quiet betrayal. He'd seen lieutenants turn on dons over parking spots. He wanted no part of that world. So he built his own, clean, disciplined, family-run. No shouting, no unnecessary blood, and absolutely no middlemen. Many people still think he had a secret deal with the mafia to stay untouched. So what do you think? Did he buy their silence? Or just outrun their radar? He also made one subtle move that changed the game entirely. He paid people on time. You'd be surprised how rare that is in the underworld. Most kingpins kept their muscle guessing. Frank didn't. He ran payroll like a factory boss. Fridays meant envelopes, full ones. That created a kind of loyalty no threat could ever match. And loyalty, in Frank's world, was the real currency. His network stretched quietly through cities and boroughs, stitched together with phone booths, folded bills, and looks that said more than words ever could. No one called him boss out loud. They just nodded. Frank didn't need to be saluted. He needed to be obeyed. Still, the system wasn't perfect. The more weight they moved, the more people they needed. And the more people they added, the more risk crept in through the seams. Some of his newer recruits weren't as careful. One cousin got caught bragging at a club. Another showed up to a stash house in a convertible with the top down, and a woman who asked too many questions. Frank noticed, and Frank hated loose ends, so he tightened the circle. Started moving more product through fewer hands. He went back to Vietnam to audit the process himself. Twice. Each time, he returned with fewer smiles and more files. He began working out of a brownstone, not far from 116th Street. No signs, no visitors. Just him and a desk, where he'd sit for hours, balancing numbers like a man doing taxes instead of trafficking heroin. He liked structure. He liked silence. And above all, he liked control. But Harlem was shifting again. The streets were getting heavier. More users. More whispers. And one day, Frank steps outside and sees something that stops him cold. A child, maybe 12, nodding off on a stoop. Barefoot. Drooling. A bag of blue magic slipping from his hand. Frank doesn't say a word. He just stares, then turns, then leaves. You might think that moment shook him, that he reconsidered everything. But it didn't. He saw that boy the same way he saw everything else, as a consequence of efficiency, not an accident, not a tragedy, just math. He'd never claimed to be a hero, but he also never admitted to being the villain. Meanwhile, Detective Richie Roberts, the man who noticed the coat at the Ali fight, hasn't let go. Richie's not like the other cops. He doesn't take bribes, doesn't get intimidated. In fact, he's broke most of the time because he refuses to pocket anything dirty. His colleagues laugh at him. Some resent him. Others just call him Boy Scout. But Richie? He's watching Frank, not just from afar. He's digging. Slowly, methodically, obsessively. Every car purchase, every property deed, every flight manifest from Vietnam that looks even a little unusual. And finally, he catches something. A courier. Low level. Nervous. Caught with a few ounces of uncut blue magic and a shaky story. Richie offers him a deal. And the kid, sweating through his knockoff suit, mumbles a name, not Frank's, but one of Frank's cousins. And just like that, the wall has its first crack. Back in Saigon, Frank's partners are starting to get spooked. The war is winding down. The air bases are changing hands. Some of the routes are drying up. Others are being watched. Frank senses the shift. He calls a meeting in his basement. 7 men, all blood. He tells them calmly that things are about to get harder, that from here on out, they move smarter. No new hires, no girlfriends in the stash houses, no flash. He pauses, looks each of them in the eye, then says, "The streets don't bear you. Your own people do." They nod, they believe him, but someone in that room will eventually talk. They always do. Frank Lucas never trusts words when a glance will do. And now, in the quiet of his basement office, he can feel the gravity shifting. Not collapsing, but tilting. Like a chair, just a little uneven. Like a whisper where there should be silence. One of the men in that room is carrying something he shouldn't. A grudge, a fear, a secret already offered to the wrong ear. He doesn't act on it yet. Frank isn't impulsive. He moves like water, slow, inevitable, unbothered by shape. But he starts paying closer attention to patterns. Who shows up on time? Who repeats themselves too often? Who forgets they're being watched? Meanwhile, Detective Richie Roberts is gathering steam. The cousin who got caught? He starts talking. Nervously, clumsily. And what he gives Richie isn't much. Just a few drop locations, a couple of nicknames. But it's enough. Enough to sketch out a structure. And Richie realizes something chilling. Frank's not running a crew. He's running a corporation. He maps it out on his apartment wall. Lines of connection, business fronts, timelines. His girlfriend calls it obsessive. Richie calls it Thursday. Historical fact? In 1971, while the Nixon administration officially declared war on drugs, the DEA was still relatively new, underfunded, and frankly, a bit of a mess. But Richie? Richie didn't care about politics. He cared about Frank. And now, with whispers of corruption floating through the NYPD, he had leverage. He starts forming a task force. Small, quiet, trustworthy. The kind of team you build when you don't trust the guy in the next cubicle. Wiretaps go up. Surveillance tightens. And through it all, Richie stays patient. Back in Harlem, Frank keeps polishing his empire. He opens new fronts. A car service. A jazz club that rarely books performers, but always has warm cash in the register. A bakery that never seems to bake. He's not hiding the money, he's blending it. Layering it until even the IRS would need a decoder ring and divine intervention to trace it all. He also starts traveling more. Quiet trips to North Carolina. Unscheduled visits to funeral homes. A surprise weekend in Saigon. His last. By now, the military routes are drying up. The war is shifting gears. The casket trick? Too hot. Too fragile. Too many people know. Frank can read the signs. So he moves faster. He buys in bulk. Stores it in safe houses lined with insulation and paranoia. Begins compressing product into bricks the size of hymnals. He plans to outlast the crackdown by flooding Harlem now, while he still can. Many people still think Frank's real downfall was pride. So what do you think? Was it ego, or just timing? Because here's the thing, Frank never wanted to be famous. Infamous maybe, but not visible. And yet visibility found him. The chinchilla coat resurfaces, this time in a photograph pinned to a corkboard in Richie's office. Not because of the coat itself, but because of who's sitting next to him. Nicky Barnes, Harlem's flashiest, loudest dealer. A man Frank deeply disliked for exactly that reason. That picture, combined with new surveillance footage, phone records, and a few loose lips, gives Richie what he needs. A wiretap warrant. The tap goes in quietly. A back room, a payphone, a bug under a diner booth. And suddenly, the music starts playing. Slow, stuttering, full of half words and code. But it's enough. Richie starts building a case, brick by brick. He doesn't make arrests yet. He's not looking for small fish. He wants the architect. Meanwhile, Frank begins to notice shadows where there shouldn't be any. A car parked too long across from the dry cleaner. A new face on the corner, one that asks questions instead of selling. A whisper from one of his men. Somebody's talking, Frank, so he does what he's always done. He tightens. Fewer meetings, fewer phone calls, everything face to face. He rotates stash houses, replaces couriers, starts paying in cash so fresh it still smells like ink. But paranoia creeps in like cold under a doorframe. He dreams of betrayal. He tells his wife, Julie, to stop attending public events. Pulls her out of charity boards. Tells her not to answer the door unless it's his knock. Julie notices. The strain, the distance. The way Frank flinches when the phone rings. He was never exactly warm, but now he's glacier-level cold. Distant, guarded, calculating. Even around her. One night, while he's smoking in the kitchen, she asks him if they're still safe. Frank just says, "Not yet," and leaves it at that. He knows what's coming, because it always does. Because this story doesn't end with retirement. It never does. And Frank? He's too smart not to see the cracks in his own design. He can feel the ceiling shifting, can smell the end before it arrives. But that doesn't mean he plans to run. No, Frank doesn't run. He prepares. He revisits old partners, rechecks hiding spots, updates names in his head, tries to figure out who the leak is. Maybe it's the cousin with the stutter. Maybe it's the girl from the stash house who talks too much after 2 drinks. Maybe it's the guy who started showing up early instead of late. Too early. Too perfect. Frank isn't sure yet, but he knows this much. The game is ending, and someone's about to knock. It's a bitter morning in 1975 when the knock finally comes. Not the kind of knock you hear in movies. No battering ram, no shouted countdown. Just 3 deliberate raps on the brownstone door, like someone asking for sugar. Frank Lucas knows instantly. He's been expecting it. He flicks his cigarette into the sink, smooths his collar, and opens the door without a word. Federal agents, dozens of them, some in suits, some in windbreakers, a few with cameras, all with eyes that don't blink. They don't wait for pleasantries. One reads the warrant. Another starts boxing up ledgers. Julie stands frozen on the staircase, barefoot, clutching a silk robe. She doesn't cry. She just watches. This was always a possibility. Frank had warned her, early and often. The raid is precise. Rooms swept, closets opened, carpets lifted, safe boxes cracked. And in the basement, under a false panel behind the furnace, they find what Richie Roberts has been chasing for years. Binders, addresses, and most damning of all, the ledgers. Frank never should have written anything down, but he did. Because control meant documentation. Because empire meant records. They arrest him quietly. No cuffs on the sidewalk. No shouting. Frank walks out under his own power, chin high, coat buttoned, like a man heading to a business meeting. Historical fact. Frank Lucas was taken into custody on January 28, 1975. The charges would eventually include drug trafficking, racketeering, and conspiracy. But the real blow wasn't what they found in his house. It was who they picked up after. Over the next 48 hours, more than 100 people are arrested across 5 states. Cousins, couriers, funeral directors, even a few soldiers stationed in Saigon who had returned to quiet suburban lives. The net had been wide. And Frank? Frank had filled it himself. Many people still think he was betrayed by an outsider. So what do you think? Could anyone outside the circle really have known that much? Back in the precinct, Richie Roberts stands across from Frank in the interrogation room. No handshakes, no anger, just two men who understand systems. Frank looks at Richie like a chess player sizing up his opponent after a long match. Richie offers coffee. Frank declines. The room smells like old paperwork and nervous sweat. Fluorescent lights buzz. Time slows. Frank says, "You're not like the others." Richie shrugs. "Neither are you." They sit. And for the first time, Frank talks. Not about everything. Not yet. But just enough. Names, roots, routines. He doesn't confess. He narrates. And Richie, ever the note-taker, writes everything down. It's not a deal, not officially, but it's the beginning of one. Outside, the press starts circling. Kingpin captured. Heroin Don taken down. Blue magic empire falls. Every headline treats Frank like the villain in a movie they've just figured out existed. Reporters scramble for quotes. Cameras chase Julie as she exits the courthouse in dark sunglasses and silence. Inside the holding cell, Frank waits. It's not fear that keeps him awake. It's boredom. He was never built for stillness. Even his rest had rhythm. And here, in these 4 beige walls, there's no movement. Just echoes and memories. He thinks of Bumpy, of the diner booth where he learned how to order without speaking, of the barber shop where a drunk soldier first mentioned Saigon, of the first brick of blue magic he held in his hands, wrapped like a gift too dangerous to open. And then he thinks of the boy on the stoop. That one image keeps looping. Bare feet, slack jaw, a blue bag slipping from fingers too small to hold any of this. And for the first time in a long while, Frank doesn't feel clever. He feels responsible. His lawyers are sharp, paid in full, well before the raid. They try every angle. Mistrial motions, chain of custody questions, even accusing Richie of bias. But the evidence is overwhelming. The ledgers don't lie. The photos don't lie. And Frank doesn't flinch. Eventually, a deal is struck. Frank agrees to cooperate fully, to testify, not just against his own people, but against corrupt cops. This is the part that changes the story. Frank Lucas doesn't just roll over. He topples systems. He gives names of NYPD officers who took bribes, DEA agents who sold confiscated heroin, judges who attended parties at his club. He doesn't whisper. He speaks with clarity. Historical fact, Frank's testimony led to the conviction of over 100 law enforcement officials, making it one of the largest exposures of police corruption in New York history. But it came at a cost. Frank's old world crumbles. Some of his cousins disown him. Others vanish entirely, retreating to small towns, changing names, erasing photos. The streets start calling him a rat. The same dealers who used to mimic his walk now spit when they hear his name. Frank doesn't argue. He just waits for sentencing. The courtroom is cold. The judge reads the counts like a grocery list. Frank stands straight, hands clasped, listening like a man hearing tomorrow's weather. He's sentenced to 70 years in federal prison. He nods once, that's all. No breakdown, no outrage. Just the quiet acceptance of a man who saw the end coming long before anyone else did. He's led away in chains, but in his mind, he's still planning. Prison doesn't change Frank Lucas so much as distill him. The world outside calls him fallen, finished, forgotten. But inside those cinderblock walls, he adapts like he always has. Not by force, not by alliance, but by watching. He's not the only king in there. The federal pen is crowded with toppled empires, bank frauds, syndicate bosses, rogue politicians. The difference is, most of them can't stop talking about the glory days. Frank doesn't bother. He listens, reads, keeps his hands clean and his ears open. He spends his first year in quiet rhythm. Up early, push-ups, instant coffee, law books, letters. He writes to Julie, sometimes just a line or two. Tell the girls I'm thinking of them. Keep the lights low at dinner. She doesn't always reply. He doesn't expect her to. He walks the yard alone. Historical fact. While incarcerated, Frank served his time at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, a facility that once housed the most dangerous federal inmates in the country. The cells were concrete, the hours long, and the rules strictly enforced. But Frank? He took to it like a banker to spreadsheets. He wasn't angry, he was reflective. He would sit with other inmates, young ones usually, and explain the mechanics of supply and demand using sugar packets and dominoes. Not to glorify what he did, but to show them how systems work. One guard joked, if you gave Frank a broom in an office, he'd run the whole prison inside of a week. Many people still think prison broke him. So what do you think? Did a cell ever hold a man like Frank Lucas? Or just give him time to refine the math? What did surprise Frank was Richie. A few months into his sentence, Richie visits, not as an agent, as a lawyer. Turns out, after the Lucas case, Richie left law enforcement and passed the bar exam, cleaned up, suited up, and started defending the very people he once hunted. Not out of betrayal, out of belief that the system, if it wanted to be better, had to work for everyone. And Frank hires him. The irony is so rich you could bottle it. There they are, two men who once stood on opposite sides of the wire, now sharing coffee across a table, reviewing parole paperwork and sentence reductions. Richie doesn't ask Frank why he did what he did. Frank doesn't ask Richie why he stuck around. They both know. Because in the end, there are only two kinds of people in this game. Those who keep playing and those who learn when to fold. Frank, it seems, is finally folding. Julie visits once, maybe twice a year. She never brings the kids, doesn't talk much, just watches him across the glass, her fingers barely resting on the metal ledge. She's not angry, just tired. Being a gangster's wife isn't glamorous. It's lonely. It's quiet in all the wrong ways. Frank never asks her to wait, never says he'll come home soon. He just smiles, and once, on a particularly cold winter visit, tells her, if I'd stayed a carpenter, we'd still be eating beans. She doesn't laugh, neither does he. Back in his cell, Frank starts writing. Not a memoir. He's too guarded for that. But notes, observations, fragments of stories. He jots down the time he saw a rival dealer cry over his own stash being stepped on too hard, or the way Harlem changed color with each season, each wave of new drug hitting the blocks like a new fashion line. He keeps the pages folded under his mattress. He also starts teaching GED classes. Tells himself it's just to pass the time, but something in him shifts when one of his students, barely 20, full of bravado, tells him, "You're smarter than my whole block, OG." Frank doesn't respond, but that night, he dreams about the stoop kid again. Same bag, same eyes. And the next morning, he starts a new class. Meanwhile, outside those walls, Harlem moves on. Blue magic becomes myth. New brands rise, trash versions, knockoffs, bolder and deadlier. The overdose rates spike. Streets get louder, sloppier. Turf wars reignite. And the name Frank Lucas? It fades into whisper, but not for long, because in 1991, after serving just under 15 years, Frank Lucas is released from prison. The man who once moved millions by phone call now steps into a world wired with cell phones, pagers, and surveillance on every corner. The streets aren't his anymore. The corners have changed hands. The players are younger, louder, and less disciplined. And Frank, he doesn't want back in. Not really. He moves slow, lives quiet. The house he returns to isn't lavish. The cars are gone. The fur coats long soled. He wears sneakers now. Stands outside his front door with his hands in his jacket pockets, as if unsure where to place them. Julie lets him back in, warily. The girls are older. The neighborhood is colder. He doesn't complain, just sips his tea and watches the news without comment. Many people still think he tried to reclaim his empire. So what do you think? Could a man like Frank ever really stop building? He walks the block sometimes. Old men nod at him. Younger ones ask for stories. He tells them about Bumpy, about Saigon, about the time he almost bought a tiger for his yard. But mostly, he tells them to stay out of it. Games changed, he says. Wasn't even fair when I played. He doesn't preach, just observes. There's a softness now, a kind of gravity earned the hard way. And when asked what he'd do differently, he usually shrugs and says, I wouldn't wear the damn coat, because in the end, that chinchilla might have been the loudest thing he ever said. It's the quiet that gets to him the most. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of urgency. No phones ringing, no knocks on the door at odd hours, no cousins needing bail money or stash houses needing rotation. Frank Lucas wakes up now to the hum of radiators and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. He drinks his coffee slow. He reads the paper out of habit, even though half the names mean nothing anymore. The game moved on without him, just like it always does. Harlem's new generation doesn't sell dope in custom-labeled bags. They sell chaos. Loud, erratic, unbranded. Frank shakes his head at the news stories. Another overdose on 125th. Another turf shooting near Lenox. These kids, he thinks, don't understand control. They want to be famous before they're stable. They burn the house down before they even furnish the living room. One afternoon, a young man, maybe 20, gold chain swinging, approaches him outside a corner store. You Frank Lucas? Frank lifts his eyes slowly. Used to be, the kid grins. My uncle used to run for you. Said you had Harlem on lock. Frank doesn't smile. He just nods. You ever think about getting back in? The kid asks, half joking. Frank levels him with a look so still, so heavy, it silences the entire sidewalk. No, he says. I already paid the price. You still saving up? And with that, he disappears into the bodega. Historical fact. After his release, Frank Lucas lived modestly. He gave a few interviews, appeared on talk shows, even worked with anti-drug programs in schools, though his involvement was always met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as redemption. Others saw it as branding. One reporter once asked him, point blank, "Do you feel remorse?" Frank's answer was as sharp as ever. "I feel regret," he said. "Not remorse. Regret is real. Remorse is what you say in court." Julie still kept a room for him. They didn't talk much about the past. There was no need. She didn't ask about Saigon. He didn't ask about the years she spent raising their daughter alone. They existed together like two tired survivors, nursing separate versions of the same memory. Every so often, someone would write a think piece or a retrospective on Blue Magic. The businessman drug dealer. The Harlem Heroin CEO. The myth of Frank Lucas began to crystallize into pop culture shorthand. The man himself. He watched it happen with the detachment of someone observing their own obituary. Many people still think American Gangster got it all right. So what do you think? Was that really Frank Lucas on screen? Or just a smoother version meant for popcorn and streaming? He'd chuckle when people brought up the movie. Denzel did okay, he'd say. Too handsome. But the walk was close. In truth, Frank didn't mind the dramatization. He understood show business. He'd been living it long before the cameras rolled. If the public wanted a clean narrative, he'd let them have it. The real story? That stayed folded inside the pages under his bed. The notebooks. By now, he had filled dozens. Not memoirs. Never that. Just thoughts, patterns, lessons. What made loyalty hold? What made men crack? Why certain corners sold more than others? How supply bends to emotion faster than to need. They were observations on human behavior dressed as drug logistics. Sometimes, late at night, he'd reread them, make edits, circle things, draw arrows between names. And then, one day, he stopped. He folded the final page, tucked it in a worn manila folder, slid it into a shoebox and pushed it to the back of his closet. Harlem didn't need it anymore. It had new ghosts now. On Sunday mornings, Frank sat on his front stoop and watched people pass. Some nodded in recognition. Others hurried past, eyes avoiding his. He didn't mind either way. The ones who nodded, they understood that some stories are more than legend. The ones who didn't, well, they were safer that way. One child, no older than 7, asked him once what he used to do. Frank looked at him, then glanced at the boy's mother, who was watching nervously from a few feet away. I was in shipping, he said softly. The boy blinked. Like boxes? Frank smiled, just barely. Yeah, you could say that. The truth was heavier than the kid could carry, and Frank knew it wasn't his job to unload anymore. He had nothing to prove. Not now. Not with the streets moving on. Not with the coat long gone and the chin lowered for good. He lived like that for years. Quiet, slow, unnoticed. Until one morning in 2019, the headlines reported it simple and small. Frank Lucas, former drug kingpin of Harlem, dies at 88. No parade, no scandal. Just a quiet closing of a chapter too loud to forget. And somewhere, on some corner in Harlem, a shadow passed unnoticed. But some stories, they don't end. They just fade into the hum of streetlights and the whispers of names said only when the wind is low. After Frank Lucas passed, Harlem didn't hold a parade. There were no murals painted overnight, no candlelight vigils. Just a few murmurs, at barber shops, at corners, in back rooms where old-timers still kept memories folded like handkerchiefs. His name was spoken quietly, like an echo you weren't sure you'd really heard. But while the world outside moved on, something lingered, because Frank hadn't just moved heroin, he'd moved structure. And structure, once introduced, is hard to unlearn. In the years after his arrest, law enforcement found themselves chasing ghosts, not just of Frank's operation, but of the blueprint he left behind. Dealers in Baltimore, Chicago, even Los Angeles began organizing differently, cleaner, tighter, using fronts, using family, disappearing into spreadsheets instead of street wars. They didn't call it doing a Lucas, but the echo was unmistakable. You could trace it like a line in a ledger. Frank's legacy, ironically, was less about drugs and more about logistics. Historical fact. In law enforcement circles, Frank Lucas is often cited, quietly, as one of the most efficient, low-visibility drug traffickers of the 20th century. Not the most violent, not the most flamboyant, just the most disciplined. And that's what terrified them, because discipline is scalable. It can be replicated. It doesn't rely on charisma. It relies on routine. In a way, Frank ran Harlem like a silent Fortune 500, just without the quarterly reports. Even his enemies would admit It was never personal with Frank, not even his competition. He didn't shoot to make statements. He didn't extort for headlines. He removed threats the way one might delete a line item on a budget, quickly and without drama. Many people still think the heroin pipeline died with him. So what do you think? Did the supply really stop? Or just reroute? If you walked through Harlem in the early 2000s, you'd still hear mentions of blue magic in corners, usually in jokes, sometimes in warnings. But by then, the brand had become a symbol, not of purity, not even of danger, but of efficiency. That was the real myth, that a man could run a multi-million-dollar drug empire by being the most organized guy in the room, and then vanish. No shootout, no betrayal, just a quiet knock, a closed ledger, and decades of silence. Frank's story became something teachers mentioned in school assemblies. Look at what he did, they'd say, and what it cost him. But you could always tell when a kid heard that and didn't flinch, heard it and saw a method, not morality, because that's what makes Frank's legacy dangerous. It doesn't ask for sympathy, it asks for understanding. Some of his former associates never recovered. A few died in prison. A couple changed their names, moved south, opened auto repair shops, raised families that never knew who they used to be. One even started preaching, said Jesus was his new boss, though his sermon still had a rhythm too close to corner talk. Julie, long since out of the spotlight, refused all interviews after Frank's death. She lived out her years quietly, occasionally spotted at church, occasionally seen walking a granddaughter to school. If she ever told the whole story, it wasn't to a journalist. It was probably in whispers, probably in kitchens, probably over tea. There's a theory, a quiet one, that Frank kept a stash somewhere. Not money, not drugs, but notes. A record of everything. Coordinates, names, totals. Some say it was buried. Others say it was burned. One man swore Frank sent it to a safety deposit box in Panama under a false name. Of course, no one ever found it. But Harlem still watches the mail. And in that absence, a myth becomes fact. Not because it's true, but because it could be. Sometimes, when the streetlights flicker just right, and the air hangs heavy with summer dust, someone will tell you Frank's ghost still walks Lenox Avenue. Not looking for trouble. Just auditing. A former dealer once said, "If Frank came back right now, we'd all sit up straighter." Not out of fear, out of respect. Because Frank Lucas didn't just break the mold. He refused to acknowledge it ever existed. And in doing so, he gave Harlem something more than drugs, more than violence. He gave it a memory laced with silence, stitched with calculation, and sealed with a whisper that still, somehow, makes people lean in. Even now, especially now, because when the lights dim and the city hums just a little lower, that's when the real stories come out. And some stories, they never really end. By the late 2000s, Harlem had changed. Gentrification crept in like polite erosion. Organic coffee shops replaced pawn shops. Yoga studios rose where jazz joints once hummed. And the stoops that used to hold court sessions now held planters with basil and thyme. But if you listened close, beneath the rhythm of subway brakes and bus engines, you could still hear it. The low murmur of old names, and one of those names was still Lucas. Not shouted anymore, not feared, but remembered. Frank, now in his late 70s, didn't move through Harlem like a king. He moved like a regular. Baseball cap, walking stick, thick glasses he wore low on his nose. His walks were short now. His knees weren't what they used to be. But the way people made space for him on the sidewalk, that hadn't changed. The younger crowd didn't know the full story. Not really. They knew the outline, knew there was a movie. knew he ran heroin, knew Denzel made him look cooler than anyone had a right to be. But the specifics, the math of it, the precision, that had faded with time. And Frank didn't correct anyone. He'd sit at a diner near 125th, same booth each time, order black coffee and eggs over medium. Sometimes someone would slide in across from him and ask about the old days. And if Frank was in the mood, he'd tell them something small. Not the headline. Just a fragment. Like the time a shipment got delayed in Bangkok and he had to convince a local general to lend him a military plane. Or the time his cousin nearly lost a whole brick in a funeral home because a coffin had been ordered for a 6'5" vet and someone forgot to account for the size difference in the hollow panels. He never bragged, just remembered. Historical fact. By the time of his death in 2019, Frank Lucas had outlived most of his contemporaries. Many of the other heroin lords of the 60s and 70s were long gone, killed, imprisoned, erased. But Frank made it to 88. Not clean, not untouched, but alive. Many people still think he regretted nothing. So what do you think? Is silence the same as peace? He was interviewed a few more times in his later years. The questions were always the same. Would you do it again? Did you ever feel guilt? What would you tell your younger self? His answers drifted with age. Once, he said, I did what I had to do. That's not the same as what I should have done. Another time, he said, the streets were sick. I didn't cure them, but I ran the pharmacy. And when a young journalist asked if he ever missed the power, Frank replied, no, power misses me. That's how he was. Sharp, without cutting. Wise, without preaching. He never tried to sound like a prophet. Just a man who'd seen all the ends of the street. Julie passed in 2013. Quietly. No fanfare. Frank didn't speak at the funeral. Just sat front row, motionless, eyes behind sunglasses, hands clasped so tight the skin went white. He didn't cry, but he didn't talk for 2 days after either. Their daughter stayed in touch, but not closely. There were scars, years lost to silence, fear, whispers at school. Still, she came by sometimes, sat with him on Sundays, brought photos of the grandkids, let him pretend things had always been stable. Frank appreciated that. By now, most of his days were slow. Morning tea, a walk if the weather allowed. He'd sit with his notebooks, not to write, just to shuffle pages, glance at old thoughts, occasionally underline something he'd already underlined years before. Patterns, always patterns. He began shredding them around 2017. 1 notebook per week. No ceremony. Just him, a small shredder, and a jazz record playing low in the background. When asked why, he simply said, some stories end better when no one else rewrites them. Still, a few survived. He kept one tucked in the drawer beside his bed. It wasn't labeled, but the cover was soft from years of hands. Inside, the first line read, Harlem never needed a king. It needed a system. Some nights, he'd read from it to himself. Not aloud, just slow, like a prayer. Like something worth remembering even if no one else could understand it. Because that was Frank in the end. Not a king, not a ghost. Just a man who once built a system so quiet, so clean, it almost worked too well, until it didn't. As his health declined, Frank Lucas didn't rage against it. He submitted the way he submitted to most inevitabilities, with calculation. Doctor's appointments were made precisely. Medications were sorted in old cigar boxes, labeled by day. He even arranged his own affairs early, well before they were urgent. Bank accounts closed, papers signed, debts, what few he acknowledged, quietly cleared. And still, He held on to routine like it was the last string tying him to the streets. Every morning, at exactly 6:15 a.m., he opened his blinds halfway, just enough to let the light hit his table. Not too much. Old habits. He brewed his coffee the same way he had since prison. Strong, black, 2 slow stirs. He never asked anyone else to make it. Said the rhythm of the spoon was more important than the taste. He shaved every other day, even when he had nowhere to go. Still used aftershave. Still folded his shirts in 3s. It wasn't vanity. It was control. And if you sat with him long enough, you'd realize that's what he missed most. Not the money, not the power, the control. Because Frank Lucas didn't just run Harlem, he engineered it. At least for a time. He replaced chaos with order, impulse with procedure. And now, in this smaller life, where everything moved on without him, that absence of control echoed loudest. Historical fact. In his final years, Frank gave talks at schools, mostly at the request of community leaders who remembered what Harlem had once been. He didn't give speeches. He answered questions, sometimes honestly, sometimes with gentle lies. He never glamorized it, but he never apologized either. I was part of it, he told one high school class. So were the cops, so were the banks. Everybody eats from somewhere. Many people still think Frank Lucas saw himself as a hero. So what do you think? Is survival something we celebrate or something we explain? He had one final interview a year before he died. A podcast, surprisingly. The host had a nervous voice, barely 20-something, trying too hard to sound seasoned. Frank listened more than he spoke. When asked what advice he'd give the youth, he said, "Watch who listens when you talk. That's where your danger lives." The host paused, said, "That's heavy," Frank replied. "Not heavy, just overlooked." The clip went viral in its own quiet way, mostly in hip-hop circles, documentary pages, and academic corners, fascinated by the paradox of the ethical gangster. As if such a thing could truly exist. Frank never saw the clip. He wouldn't have cared much. He still had dial-up internet, and he liked it that way. Information, he once said, should come slow enough for you to smell it first. He stopped walking the block around late 2018. Legs weren't steady, eyes weren't sharp, and too many new faces on the street made him feel like an exhibit. He started sitting by the window instead. Same spot, same time. Watching, not judging, just tallying. There were still phone calls now and then. A nephew from Charlotte, an old associate who found Jesus and now led food drives. Sometimes it was Richie, calling to check in. Their relationship had become strangely natural over the years. 2 old tacticians with nothing left to prove. Richie once asked if Frank had forgiven himself. Frank chuckled. "Forgiveness is church talk, Richie." I just stopped repeating. He kept that one line of poetry on his nightstand. The street remembers, even when the names change. He said he liked how that line made no promises. And then, one April morning, his nurse knocked twice and got no answer. She found him in bed, hands folded like a bishop, glasses still on. The room smelled like the usual: peppermint oil, black coffee, and old paper. No sign of struggle, just stillness, like the end of a ledger. No debts, no footnotes, just full stop. The funeral was small. Intentionally so. A few family members, a minister who spoke like he only half knew the story. The eulogy didn't mention heroin, didn't mention Saigon. Just a line about a complicated man who lived several lifetimes in one. Julie had asked for it that way. There were no reporters, no documentaries waiting outside, just wind and an overcast sky. A few gray suits, some bowed heads, and one old man in the back who might have once worn a badge. Afterward, they buried him under a tree. No mausoleum, no headline, just a simple plaque. Frank Lucas, 1930-2019. A life of many lessons, and maybe that's how it should have ended. Quiet, measured, without fireworks, because Frank Lucas never needed noise. He built around it, and when he left, the silence felt earned. The earth settled quickly above Frank's grave. There were no second-day processions, no vigils, no sons of former rivals tossing roses or dropping cryptic messages on the marble. The world, busy as ever, didn't pause long. But that didn't mean Frank was forgotten. His story had already outgrown the body. The first ripples came weeks later, in small rooms and quiet circles. Criminology classes, ethics debates, hip-hop lyrics disguised as parables. Professors argued over whether Frank Lucas represented a new category of criminal, the ethical tactician, a man who ran an empire not by fear or spectacle, but with restraint, delegation, and frightening calm. One lecture at NYU posed the question, can efficiency be evil? A slide followed, showing photos of Frank beside logos like Apple and Amazon. It wasn't praise, but it wasn't condemnation either, just acknowledgement. Historical fact? In 2007, American Gangster had reignited curiosity about Lucas's life. Box office numbers soared. Students who weren't even born during his arrest now cited his tactics in essays, not his violence, his operations. Many people still think the film overstated his sophistication. So what do you think? Did the story elevate him too high? Or simply uncover what others refused to see? Back in Harlem, the streets barely whispered anymore. That era had passed. New kings had risen, fallen, and been replaced by algorithms, credit fraud, and cryptocurrencies. The old corners were now juice bars and co-ops. But here and there, someone would still bring him up. Usually it began with, "Man, remember when Harlem had structure?" A nod would follow, then silence, then maybe a small smile. Frank had been gone over a year when an old courier, one of the early ones who'd carried envelopes upstate and never once asked what was inside, found himself invited to speak at a community panel on the economics of the drug trade. He didn't say much, just leaned into the mic and said, "Frank taught us time is money. But more than that, timing is everything." The room was quiet after that, because that lesson, that patience, that long game, is what made Frank Lucas different. He didn't flood Harlem in a week. He didn't buy respect with chains and champagne. He planted routines. He audited his people. He made the business hum like an engine tuned too perfectly to notice. And when it all collapsed, he walked into the fall with his coat buttoned and his hands in view. Even his enemies admitted. He didn't blink. There were rumors about his archives. Supposedly, one box remained unopened. A journalist named Thompson claimed to have seen it. Letters, invoices, faded photos of airbase tarmacs and coded ledgers with Saigon postmarks. But when pressed, he said the box was gone. Disappeared, he told a podcast host. Or maybe someone made it disappear. The mystery only grew. Was Frank preparing a book? Did he have a final card to play? Or did he, like always, understand the power of leaving things unfinished? Legacy, after all, is shaped most by what people imagine you left behind. One of his grandsons, born long after the headlines, grew up to study architecture. When asked why, he said, "Because I like building things that last." He didn't mention Frank. Didn't have to. There was something in the way he straightened his jacket cuffs, the quiet calculation in his tone, the way he paused just slightly before answering a question. The control, it lived on, quiet and inherited. Julie's name never left the mailbox. Even years after her passing, Neighbors kept it there out of respect. She survived Frank Lucas. One old tenant once said, "That's worth remembering all on its own." And Richie? He went on practicing law until retirement. Occasionally, someone would recognize him from the movie. He'd nod politely, wave it off. "I was just the guy who paid attention," he'd say. But he knew. He knew what it meant to bring down a system that large, and what it cost, not just the man inside it, but the city that had allowed it to exist for so long. Because Frank's empire didn't rise in a vacuum. It rose in neglect, in corruption, in silence, and for a while, it operated so smoothly that nobody even noticed it was there, until it was. And by then, it was too late. Frank Lucas never intended to be folklore. He'd scoff at the word if you said it to his face. Folklore was for the dead, the dreamers, the ones who needed embellishment to be remembered. Frank had always believed in things that could be counted. Bricks, bags, bills, names. And yet, now, years after he left the game and even the world itself, his story had morphed into exactly that. A whispered myth with just enough truth to be dangerous. The new generation, raised on podcasts, dramatizations, and second-hand stories, doesn't remember the cold weight of blue magic. They don't know the smell of plastic wrap fresh off a Saigon shipment. They haven't seen the eyes of a user too far gone to blink. But they remember the name, Lucas. It hangs in the air like dust after demolition. One Brooklyn graffiti artist, barely in his 20s, spray-painted Frank's silhouette across an abandoned Harlem building. No caption, just the outline of a man in a fedora, coat collar up, briefcase in hand. The stance said everything. "I'm not here to explain." The city painted over it within the week, but the photo lived on, shared, reposted, reinterpreted. Some thought it was a protest. Some thought it was nostalgia. One teenager commented, "Dude was a businessman before the streets had suits." He probably didn't know the half of it, but the point stood. Frank didn't sell style, he sold system, historical fact. At the height of his operation, Frank Lucas cut out the traditional mafia infrastructure so effectively that even they took notice. Quietly, reluctantly. He wasn't part of their story, but he was suddenly competing with it. And in New York, that meant something. Many people still think the mafia let him rise. So what do you think? Did they respect the hustle, or just fail to see it in time? After his fall, law enforcement restructured entire task forces, new protocols, new watchdog units. Internal affairs got bigger teeth. But for every new precaution, someone would always ask, what if another Frank shows up? Because that's what keeps them up at night. Not the loud criminals, the quiet ones, the ones who don't want the party, don't crave attention, just want order, routine, margin. Those are the ones who build empires before the world knows the ground has shifted. Back in Harlem, the last people to remember Frank personally have mostly aged out. Some sit on plastic chairs outside barbershops, watching time move like slow traffic. Some tell stories that start with, "Now this was before your time." Others just shake their heads when they hear his name. But here's the thing about memory. It's selective, and it's generous. To some, Frank Lucas was a destroyer, a man who poisoned his own, who introduced high-grade heroin into veins that would never be the same. A man whose product didn't just kill, it outperformed. To others, he was proof of possibility, that a black man could outthink, outbuild, and outmaneuver every barrier placed in his way, that he could run an international operation with military precision, that he could create something, however dangerous, that rivaled institutions long thought untouchable. Both can be true. Maybe both are true. There's one more story, one that never made the papers, an ex-dealer turned pastor, once a low-level runner in Frank's network, claimed in a sermon that Frank once visited him in secret after prison. Said he didn't come to ask for forgiveness, didn't even mention the past, just sat in the last pew of the church one afternoon, listened to the music, and on his way out, pressed a crisp envelope into the pastor's hand. Inside, $5,000 in cash and a note that read, "For the ones I can't apologize to, the story can't be confirmed. No one else saw it. But the pastor insists it happened. Says he kept the note. Says it still smells like cigar smoke." That's the thing with Frank. Even in the end, even when the noise had died down, he still knew the value of silence wrapped in precision. He never needed a comeback. He didn't chase redemption. He understood that time would tell the story better than he ever could. And now it is, quietly, reluctantly, like a whisper slipping out of the mouth of a city that once swore it had forgotten him. Because you don't forget the man who redefined your rules. You just stop saying his name out loud. Time, as it always does, softened the edges of Frank Lucas's story. By 2025, his name had migrated from memory to media. A few more documentaries surfaced. Slick edits, ominous music, dramatic voiceovers calling him Harlem's phantom executive. There were panels and think pieces, YouTube retrospectives with thumbnails of him beside flaming dollar signs. Everyone, it seemed, had a version of Frank. Few had the patience to sit with the actual math of him, because that's what he really was. Not a cowboy, not a mobster, not a tragic figure caught in the wrong era. Frank Lucas was a numbers man. He didn't sell heroin. He sold trust. He sold predictability in a world that rewarded panic. And now, all these years later, his legacy breathes not in headlines, but in margins. Look closely at how modern cartels structure their supply chains. The redundancy, the brand control, the balance sheets, the loyalty built not on fear, but on stability. You'll see echoes of Frank. Not because he invented the playbook, but because he committed to it. One DEA agent, long retired, once said in an interview, "Frank Lucas made us rewrite the manual, because for once, we weren't chasing a criminal. We were chasing an operator." Historical fact? After Lucas's sentencing, federal agencies began modeling parts of their criminal analytics on business auditing techniques. Not just surveillance, workflow modeling. Why? Because Frank showed them it was possible to build an illicit empire with the bones of a Fortune 100 company. Many people still think he was just lucky. So what do you think? Was it chance? Or the slow burn of a man who never once bet on anything he hadn't already measured? Frank's daughter, now in her 50s, lives quietly. Teaches finance at a community college in New Jersey. She rarely brings up her father, except to say, "He was complicated. You don't have to approve of a blueprint to understand the math." She keeps a single photo of him on her desk. It's not the one from the press, not the chinchilla coat or the courtroom sketch. It's him at a park, mid-laugh, holding a paper bag with a lunch inside. You'd never guess who he was. That's the point, because Frank knew how to disappear long before he had to. The silence he left behind wasn't empty. It was designed. And now, as Harlem pulses under new lights and new names, his presence lingers more like gravity than like ghost. You don't see it, but it shapes everything that moves. A street corner still has his rhythm. A whispered transaction still echoes his model. And every so often, a new name rises in the underworld, only to be compared, fairly or not, to Frank Lucas. The blueprint is still breathing, and it's quieter than ever, which is why we end here, not with a bang, but with breath. A final moment of stillness, of filtered sunlight against a window pane, of silence that weighs more than any confession. of a life lived in equations where the final variable was always this: what remains when the power is gone? And maybe this is what remains: the stoop, the paper bag, the slow laugh, and a name carved not in stone, but in routine. So now we soften. Let the images dim. Let Harlem fade to lamplight. Its corners no longer watched. Its shadows no longer whispering. Let Frank, older now, quieter than myth, sit again at that diner table, coffee cooling, eyes scanning a page he's already memorized. Nothing left to prove. Nothing urgent enough to move quickly. Just breath and the quiet. Inhale, a life built in silence. Exhale, a story told in full. Let your shoulders drop now. Let the hum of the city slow to a whisper, because this night isn't about legacy. It's about letting go of weight. Close your eyes. There's nothing left to chase. No more corners to watch. No more ledgers to balance. Just the peace of knowing that everything, the chaos, the structure, the storm, and the stillness, has finally gone quiet. Sleep well. You've made it. The silence after Frank's death was not absence. It was residue. The kind that clings to back rooms and ledger sheets, to unspoken names and unopened drawers. It didn't echo. It rested, just as Frank had always preferred. Because the most dangerous truths are not the ones shouted through bullhorns. They're the ones filed away neatly, waiting to be noticed by someone curious enough to ask why. And for years, no one really asked. Not the feds, who'd filed his case under resolved. Not the city, too busy rebranding Harlem into real estate brochures. Not even the streets, which had moved on to flashier syndicates and louder wars. But in time, questions began to stir again. Not about Frank, but about the system he'd exposed. Some former officers, long retired, started to speak in hushed tones about just how close Frank had come to restructuring the narcotics economy of an entire city, about how many agencies had to coordinate just to untangle the infrastructure he built, about how, had he moved differently, just slightly differently, he might have never been caught at all. Historical fact? The Lucas investigation led to one of the largest internal corruption probes in New York's law enforcement history. Over 100 officers were implicated, many of them quietly reassigned, others prosecuted. Yet, for all that noise, the structure survived. The game simply adapted. Many people still think Frank's empire was unique. So what do you think? Was it a one-time anomaly? Or a blueprint that's still in someone's drawer? In 2022, a classified internal memo surfaced, briefly, within an interagency training seminar. It referenced Frank-type systems, shorthand for distribution networks designed to avoid middlemen, eliminate exposure, and rely on familial loyalty. The fact that his name had become an internal category says more than any headline ever could, because systems outlast men. And Frank didn't just deal dope. He built systems. The funeral homes, the packaging, the routing schedules, the ledgers, all run with the cold, slow logic of someone who trusted nothing but process. He'd once said, "Fear's a blunt tool. Routine is sharper." That principle had lived on, quietly, in corners of the country where drugs still moved like current under thin ice, where family dinners still doubled as operational briefings, where some kid with a backpack and a notebook full of figures might just be mapping out his own version of blue magic. Not because Frank encouraged it, but because the system worked, even now, in universities and law enforcement symposiums. His name occasionally appears in PowerPoint slides. Lucas Model, disintermediation in criminal logistics, usually followed by an awkward silence when the instructor realizes just how admirably efficient it all sounds. Because the truth, uncomfortable as it is that every good system teaches something, even if what it teaches is dangerous, back in Harlem, the final traces of Frank's world continued to vanish. The brownstone where he ran operations was remodeled into a tech incubator. The funeral home closed, replaced by a trendy boutique that sells hand-poured candles and vintage jeans. And yet, sometimes, just sometimes, someone walks by those places a little slower, pauses, looks up at a window, not out of superstition, but out of recognition, because even if they don't know exactly what happened there, they know something did. They feel it in the rhythm of the sidewalk, in the way the door hinges creak, like they're remembering something they were told to forget. Julie's grave is quiet, kept simple, like Frank's. Their daughter had the stones placed side by side under a weeping elm. No frills, no statues, just names and years, and the soft, unassuming word, peace. She visits twice a year, not to speak, just to sit. Once, a former reporter spotted her there, asked if she ever wished her father had made different choices. She turned, not unkindly, and said, "We all have to live with what our people built." He tried to build control, but control always runs out. And then she left, slow steps through leaves and old wind, because maybe that's the real story. Not the drugs, not the money, not even the betrayal, but the illusion that control could outlast the need for it. Control, for Frank Lucas, had always been the quiet god, not worshipped out loud, not etched into marble, but served day after day in small, methodical offerings, a call placed precisely on time, a ledger line ruled perfectly straight, a shipment routed not just to avoid risk, but to erase it. Even in his absence, that same quiet theology lingered in the way his story was told, or rather, not told. His rise had been dramatic. His fall had been historic. But what lay in between, the decades of system, of discipline, of cold, intelligent governance, was too silent for easy myth. And silence doesn't trend, so the public forgot the middle. Instead, they remembered the coat. That infamous fur, caught in flashbulbs at ringside, cost more than a year's rent for most New Yorkers in 1971. For many, it was the beginning of his end. But for Frank, it had never been about flash. The coat wasn't vanity. It was camouflage, a disguise, not from the streets, but from the narrative. He wore it not to be seen, but to be misunderstood. Because sometimes the best way to stay invisible is to show up too bright. Historical fact? That very coat now sits in storage at a federal evidence facility, unlabeled, forgotten, its tag long faded, somewhere in a climate-controlled box, beneath a stack of photos and manifests, the single most symbolic item in Frank Lucas's rise and fall waits unceremoniously for disposal or decay. Many people still think he wore it to show off. So what do you think? Was it really pride, or a test to see who would notice? In the years since his passing, new versions of his empire, fractured, decentralized, have appeared, if briefly. None last, because none have him. What they miss is not just the vision, but the discipline behind the vision. Frank didn't just move product, he understood logistics, risk assessment, HR strategy, inventory control. He had backup suppliers, rotation schedules. He ran like a multinational, and when he failed, it was not from within, but from pressure applied across systems simultaneously. That kind of takedown, rare, expensive, and built not just to catch a man, but to dismantle an idea. Because Frank represented something more dangerous than drugs. He proved the underworld could organize, and organized crime is manageable. But efficient crime, that scares governments. So after Frank, they watched closer. Wiretaps became more sensitive. Asset seizures more aggressive. Intelligence sharing expanded. All because one man, with no formal education, no crime family lineage, no army of soldiers, had forced entire agencies to adapt. You don't put that in a textbook, you bury it in process. And yet, pieces still surface. A graduate thesis from a Georgetown student recently argued that Frank's business model influenced legal industries, that his idea of cutting out bloated middle layers to improve product quality was mirrored in direct-to-consumer brands in fashion, health, and even food. It wasn't an accusation, it was a compliment, whether intended or not, because Frank had always known, the product is never the story. The system is, and as long as systems can be built, so too can shadows walk through them. Back in Harlem, the streets have gone full circle. The same corners Frank once walked are now cleaner, lit, rebranded as cultural corridors. But some nights, when the lights buzz and traffic dips low, people still talk. An older man outside a laundromat will say, "That used to be one of Frank's." A younger one, half listening, might ask, "Who?" And the reply, never loud, always simple. Doesn't matter now, but he made it all run quiet. That word again, quiet. The hum beneath the chaos, the hand beneath the handshake, because that's how Frank moved. Not to be loved, not even to be remembered, but to be felt, like gravity. You don't notice it until it shifts, and by then, it's already moved everything around you. There's a certain poetry in the way Harlem forgets. It doesn't erase, it layers. Old ghosts become scaffolding for new dreams. Cracked bricks get painted over. A bakery replaces a dry cleaner. A yoga studio hums where policy meetings once whispered over bulletproof tables. And Frank Lucas? He becomes a layer too. Not gone, just quieter. Some say that's the way he wanted it. Others say it was inevitable. But one thing's certain, he's not entirely lost. Every now and then, someone opens a drawer and finds a photo, a receipt, a phone number jotted on the back of a matchbook in impossibly neat handwriting. There's a kind of ghostliness in that. Frank's legacy doesn't haunt. It catalogs. You'll find it in the most unexpected places. An old man in New Jersey who still keeps his wingtips polished every Sunday, just in case the call comes. A former customs officer who once flagged a coffin manifest in 1972 and was told quietly, "Let it pass." A funeral director in Queens who still triple checks the weight of caskets, even though no one's asked him to in decades. That's the weight of system, not the kind that screams, the kind that remembers you forgot to ask something important. Historical fact. At the time of his arrest, Frank Lucas wasn't just operating in Harlem. His network touched Newark, Philadelphia, even parts of Atlanta and Detroit. The full extent of it has never been entirely mapped. Too many transactions, too many cash-only deals, too many couriers trained to forget. Many people still think his empire was limited to New York. So, what do you think? If the product kept moving and the money kept coming, does a border really matter? His reach wasn't loud. It was efficient. Even the term blue magic lived on. Not as a brand, but as a standard. In certain circles, it became a benchmark for product purity. "This ain't blue magic," they'd say, dismissing weaker heroin. Or, "This is that pre-Frank cut," meaning raw, untampered, potent. Frank's story, divorced from time and geography, became shorthand for control, for intelligence, for the possibility that one man could outbusiness the mob without ever joining them. But there's irony in the way he's remembered. The narrative tilts toward either glorification or condemnation. Very few stand in the uncomfortable middle, where most of Frank's life actually lived. He wasn't a Robin Hood. He wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a man who saw a broken system and built one that worked better. It just happened to run on addiction. Even he knew the contradiction. You could see it in his eyes when kids asked him questions in school gyms. He'd pause, every time, just long enough for you to see the calculation, the weighing of truth versus impact. He rarely chose confession, but when he did, it came out in short, sharp lines. I made money. I lost people. I fed the city. Then it fed on itself. I didn't sell poison. I sold reliability. The poison came with the territory. One interviewer pressed him about whether he ever considered switching careers, maybe using his skills in legal business, real estate, anything else. Frank just leaned back and said, "You think I didn't try? I wore a suit, but the room saw skin first, and maybe that was the core of it." Frank didn't build an empire because he loved crime. He built it because the legitimate doors kept closing, and he wasn't the kind of man who stood around waiting for keys. He made his own. Later in life, when someone asked what he wanted to be remembered for, he didn't hesitate. For how I made it work, not what I made. And that's the blueprint he leaves behind. Not the heroin, not the headlines, not even the betrayal. Just a system, a method, a whisper of efficiency so clean, it scared institutions into evolution. Because if Frank Lucas could build that with nothing but discipline, blood ties, and silence, what else could be restructured? That question still hangs, uncomfortable, unfinished, and very, very alive. By now, most of the streets that once knew Frank Lucas have changed faces multiple times. Where deals were once whispered beneath broken street lamps, couples now walk dogs. Rent has gone up. The corner bodega is a wine bar, and the only lines outside buildings are for weekend brunch. But if you listen carefully, really carefully, you'll hear something strange about these spaces. They remember things, not like people do. Not with stories, with stillness. A pause in foot traffic where men once waited with pockets full of glassine. A narrow alleyway that always seems too quiet at noon. A stoop no one sits on, though the view is perfect. Harlem carries memory, the way old jazz carries a beat beneath the melody. You don't notice it at first, but it holds everything together. And Frank's presence lives in the subtext now. In 2024, a graduate student from Columbia started a project called Legacies of Invisible Infrastructure. It focused on criminal networks that left behind no digital record, no emails, no databases, just effect. One of the profiles was Frank Lucas. The student mapped out how supply chains once moved through Harlem, not through threats, but through quiet precision. Her paper pointed out something striking. Frank's network had fewer personnel than a single modern-day startup, yet he outpaced competitors tenfold. Her conclusion? Frank Lucas didn't run a drug ring. He ran a principles-based system that happened to move heroin. Historical fact? During Lucas's reign, his internal loss rate, product lost, stolen, or compromised, was estimated at less than 5%. For street-level narcotics distribution, that's unheard of. Most operations lose 20-30% just from miscounting and middleman skimming. Frank ran tighter than pharmacies. Many people still think drug empires are built on muscle. So what do you think? Can a calculator ever be more dangerous than a gun? Because that's what Frank proved. That precision is a weapon. His men weren't chosen for violence. They were chosen for obedience, for their ability to follow a schedule, for their resistance to impulse. Frank didn't want soldiers. He wanted systems with names. Even his stash houses had rules. No women, no parties, no phone calls, no exceptions. And if someone broke the rules, he wasn't loud about it. He just made sure they didn't get the address next time. That quiet, almost clerical cruelty unnerved people. Not because it was heartless, but because it was so professional. When the feds finally brought him down, they didn't find chaos. They found documentation. ledgers, notebooks, timetables. The case built itself. But even then, they respected it. One agent wrote in his memoir, "You could hate the man, but you had to admit he had better filing than we did." Frank knew systems break when they rely on emotion. So he trained his people to care less, to smile less, to act like tellers at a quiet bank, and he taught them well. Years later, during a parole hearing for one of his cousins, the judge asked why he'd followed Frank so blindly. The man, gray at the temples now, simply said, "He was the first person who ever gave me a schedule and expected me to keep it." It wasn't power that Frank wielded, it was expectation, and that stays with people longer than fear ever could. After his death, a few tried to imitate the model. Smart young men, efficient. Some even came close. But they couldn't keep the silence, couldn't resist the flash. Frank's greatest trick had never been building the empire. It was leaving it quietly. No memoirs, no sit-down interviews full of late-life revision, no loud return to the stage, just vanishing, like he always promised he could. There's something almost surgical about it, like the final line in a ledger, like a page torn clean, no smudge. And now, all that remains are the outlines, a framework so elegant it hums through time, even as its creator rests in a grave with no fanfare. A ghost made not of myth, but of method. And Harlem? Harlem just keeps building, layer after layer, story after story, not forgetting Frank Lucas, just folding him into the foundation. There's an old saying in Harlem. Some people leave, some people echo. Frank Lucas? He echoes, not through murals or plaques, not even through direct lineage. His echo hums through the logic that now governs the streets, through the rhythm of operations too precise to be chaotic. And though his name might not be spoken every day, his system, his meticulous, almost mathematical approach to crime, remains an invisible scaffold in the minds of those who study power. That's the strange legacy of a man like Frank. He didn't inspire loyalty through fear. He inspired compliance through consistency. One of his former lieutenants, now a retiree who works in a community garden, once explained it like this: Frank didn't make you scared. He made you sure. And when you're sure, you move different. Historical fact: when DEA analysts began compiling data on criminal organizations in the late 70s, they found Frank's model so unusual that it didn't fit their existing framework. They created a new category: closed-circuit syndicate. No external partnerships, minimal exposure, maximum control. Even now, you hear the language in business seminars: minimize middlemen, streamline distribution, own the supply chain. Frank did it in the 1960s without spreadsheets, software, or venture capital. Just phone booths, loyalty, and an uncanny ability to sense weakness 2 steps before it arrived. Many people still think he was just another dealer. So what do you think? Can someone break the law and still rewrite the rules? Because that's what Frank did. He didn't just move heroin. He moved certainty in an uncertain world. And certainty is addictive. After his release, when asked what he missed most, Frank said, "Not the money, not the cars, the rhythm. Knowing the day before it happened. Waking up and knowing what the numbers should be before I saw them." That rhythm was everything. Even his home life mirrored the structure of his operation. Meals at the same time, calls returned in sequence, envelopes sealed the same way every week. His wife, Julie, once told a reporter, Frank didn't run a house. He managed a grid with throw pillows, and when the grid fell, he didn't panic. He adjusted. In prison, he read contracts, taught budgeting, wrote notes that bordered on sermons. Control isn't dominance, it's the absence of crisis. Another read, power doesn't raise its voice, It reviews quietly. He said it was just to pass time. But those notes, those quiet, precise sketches of systems and philosophies, were his true legacy. At one point, a non-profit approached him about publishing them, turning them into a book about leadership or strategy. Frank declined. "I already wrote it," he said, "with my life. Let them study that instead." And they did, not all at once, not loudly, but here and there, bits of it found their way into the world. A line quoted in an urban economics seminar. A blueprint cited in a criminal justice reform panel. Even a mentor at a startup accelerator once told a founder, "Keep it tight. Think Frank Lucas tight." It wasn't about the crime. It was about the design. One day, a local high school held a debate titled Legacy of Lucas, Genius or Menace. The auditorium was half full. The arguments were loud, passionate. A girl in the front row stood up and said, "Maybe he was both. Maybe the worst thing he did was prove you could be brilliant without mercy." Silence followed. Because how do you argue with that? Frank Lucas had no illusions about how he'd be remembered. He used to say, "If you're lucky, history forgets your worst day. If you're smart, you never have a day bad enough to remember." But Harlem remembered, and quietly, the world did too. Not with statues, but with systems, and in that soft hum of efficiency. The kind that lingers after the noise, after the rise, after the fall. You can still hear him, even now, especially now, when the lights go down and the numbers still add up. There's something eerie about how clean a system looks when it's empty. Years after Frank Lucas's empire crumbled, federal agents revisited old case files, not to reopen them, but to train the next generation. They brought out the boxes, ledgers, photos, copies of burner phone logs, diagrams of stash house rotations. One agent, fresh to the narcotics unit, looked over a 1972 map of Frank's distribution grid and asked, "Why is there so little red tape?" The veteran just shrugged. Because he ran it like it mattered. Frank didn't tolerate improvisation. That's what separated him from the chaos merchants. There were no off days, no lucky breaks. Every gram moved because it was supposed to. If something didn't go as planned, it wasn't fate. It was failure, and failure had consequences. Quiet, clinical ones. Historical fact? According to declassified DEA training materials, Frank's organization had one of the lowest internal violence rates among large-scale narcotics rings. Enforcement, when necessary, was usually strategic exile. People just stopped getting called, and that was enough. Many people still think the silence around Frank after prison was fear. So, what do you think? Can respect outlive fear? Or does it just change shape? The answer might be found in the places no one talks about. The safe houses in Newark, now dusty duplexes. The brownstone offices, now renovated into artist lofts. The warehouse in Yonkers, its floor still faintly marked with faded chalk patterns, grids used for sorting product, just beneath a coat of gray paint. Every so often, someone stumbles upon something. An old ledger fragment, a photo, a hidden drawer behind drywall. And every time, there's the same reaction. Why is this so clean? Because Frank Lucas never did anything halfway. Even his downfall was neat. No shootouts. No pleas. Just a full name on a docket and a quiet walk through a courtroom door. And afterward, he faded. Not into myth, but into model. That's the part that people miss. Frank's power didn't come from fear or charisma. It came from design, from showing people how a system could function in a world built to break them. Not perfectly, not morally, but effectively. He taught a generation, some knowingly, some by accident, that order was possible, even if what you were ordering was chaos. A sociology professor once described it like this: Frank Lucas didn't inspire admiration, he inspired imitation, and that's always more dangerous. His later years were less about empire and more about routine. Church on Sundays, tea at noon, a walk, if his legs allowed, a glance at the paper, and always, a watch on his wrist, ticking just slightly ahead, because Frank had spent too long living 2 minutes before the rest of the world. Julie noticed it once, just a few months before her passing. He'd already folded the napkin before the waitress brought the check, already stood before the car arrived. She smiled and said, "You still living like someone's coming?" Frank didn't answer, but his silence said yes, because systems like his don't just stop. They wait, they pause, they adapt, and somewhere, whether in Harlem or Newark, or a city not yet aware it's being shaped by echoes, a young man is watching, learning, measuring the street not in noise, but in intervals. He may not know Frank's name, but he'll recognize the structure, the consistency, the weight of silence wrapped in routine. And one day, when someone asks him how he learned to move like that, he might just say, "I don't know. I just understood early what makes things hold together." That's the legacy, not the crime, the comprehension. And that's why Frank Lucas still matters. Not because of what he did, but how he did it. There's a rhythm to the way legacies dissolve, slow, like steam off pavement after a summer rain. They don't vanish with thunder. They seep, evaporate, blend into the air until what's left is not the story itself, but the feeling that something once mattered here. Frank Lucas's name doesn't echo through Harlem in the way it used to. There are no t-shirts, no murals, no corner claimed in his honor. But for those who understand systems, for those who watch how things move, not just where, his fingerprint is still visible in the alignment. Even now, a shipment that arrives too early, a ledger kept too neat, a corner crew that operates with rotations and quiet efficiency. You can feel it. Somewhere along the chain, someone studied Frank's game, even if they didn't know his name. Historical fact. Modern drug enforcement operations still refer to legacy networks like Lucas's when calibrating risk. When new rings are discovered using internal-only staff, or when no phone traces exist, they're labeled as having compartmentalized operational signatures. Frank's model was the first one formally documented under that code, not because he was loud, because he wasn't. And it's that silence that outlasts everything. Many people still think silence is a sign of weakness. So what do you think? Is staying quiet or staying standing the real show of power? Julie used to say that Frank's real gift was making people believe they had options. He never told anyone what to do. He just arranged the world in such a way that every road circled back to him. And maybe that's what structure really is. Not control, but curation. He curated Harlem's drug trade the way a conductor arranges sound, noisy in parts, but beneath it all, there was rhythm, sequence, tempo. That's why the noise that came after him felt so off-key, too chaotic, too impatient. Frank's successors didn't inherit the system. They just copied the results. And that's where they failed, because he didn't build an empire by reacting. He built it by forecasting. He didn't ask what was happening. He asked what would. A former DEA agent once described him as the first criminal who made us feel like we were late to the meeting. And that's exactly how Frank liked it. Even in his final years, when his hands trembled and his voice softened, the air around him felt calculated. He answered slowly, moved deliberately. He gave you time to underestimate him, and then slipped ahead by inches you didn't notice. There's one more story. This one comes from a hospice nurse, long after the headlines had faded. She said Frank kept a small box near his bed. Inside were a few folded notes, old ones. No names, just initials. Letters written in neat, mechanical script. She never read them, but she asked once what they were. Frank looked up, smiled faintly, and said, "Mistakes I paid for. People I didn't. No anger, no confession, just a ledger still being tallied." That was Frank Lucas, always accounting, always balancing the difference between what he owed and what he owned. He died with very little. No empire, no money to speak of, no surviving business fronts. But the blueprint, still intact, taught in whispers, referenced in lectures, studied by people who want to build anything, legal or otherwise, that lasts. Because at the center of Frank's life wasn't heroin. It wasn't Harlem. It wasn't even money. It was the idea that if you can understand a system well enough, you can bend it. Not violently, not loudly, but with small, deliberate pressure until the whole thing moves in your favor. And when it no longer does, you leave quietly. Because if you built it right, if you built it like Frank Lucas, then it will keep moving long after you're gone. Sometimes, the most enduring legacies aren't carried by the loudest voices, but by the softest corrections. A corner boy who gets taught how to count correctly, not just how to collect. A young crew who learns to rotate stash houses weekly, even if they can't remember where the rule came from. A runner who insists on the same drop time every day, because that's how the old heads used to do it. They don't know it, but they're quoting Frank Lucas, not the man, the method. He never called himself a teacher. But the streets? They took notes, and decades later, his ghost walks not in whispers, but in efficiencies. There was a brief resurgence of interest in Frank around 2027, when a high-profile federal raid uncovered a new distribution ring in the Midwest. Clean fronts, layered structure, all family, all internal. When asked during a press conference how the ring had operated for so long without detection, one official said, "It's a page right out of the Lucas playbook." They meant it as condemnation, but in certain circles, that line was met with a nod of recognition, because if the system still works, then so does the blueprint. Historical fact? The concept of vertical integration, controlling every level of a supply chain from production to point of sale, was common in legal business long before Frank Lucas. But in illegal economies, he applied it with a kind of cold perfection. He didn't invent it. He just proved it could survive bullets. Many people still think the street killed him. So what do you think? Can a man die if the thing he built still breathes? Frank never lived for applause. If anything, he dodged it. During the brief flash of fame following American Gangster, he gave only a handful of interviews, and in most of them, he downplayed everything, not out of modesty, out of strategy. One time, during a taped conversation, the interviewer leaned in and said, "So, at the height, what were you making per week?" Frank adjusted his collar, looked off camera, and said, "Enough to not answer that question." That was always the trick. Not the deal itself, but the deniability within the silence. Julie once said that Frank's power came from how little he needed to be seen. And she was right. Most men build empires and stand at the top. Frank built one and stood behind the ledger. No spotlight, just the totals. Back in Harlem, the last remaining piece of Frank's physical empire, an old dry cleaner's storefront, was converted into a neighborhood library annex. The building was gutted, modernized. But during renovations, workers found a rusted metal file box behind a false panel in the rear wall. Inside, nothing, just dust. But taped to the underside of the lid was a faded index card. In block letters, written in the same perfect handwriting seen in so many old ledgers, it read, "The system is the silence, nothing else." The building supervisor had it framed and hung near the checkout desk. Not as tribute, just as curiosity. Most visitors walk past it, But every now and then, someone stops, stares, leans in, and wonders. There's something powerful about that. The idea that an entire life, a whole criminal enterprise, could be reduced to a 5-word principle. No bragging, no apology, just a rule that still holds. Because Frank Lucas didn't ask for legacy. He designed for it. He set up redundancies, controlled narratives, limited exposure, protected the core. And the core wasn't the drugs, it was order. That's what made him last longer than the rest. Not the muscle, not the myth, the math. And now, when the world moves too fast, when syndicates fail in months, when corners change hands before names are learned, you can almost hear Frank sighing from some quiet corner of history. You move too loud, too fast, too proud. He wouldn't laugh, just review. Maybe, in the end, that's what separates builders from dealers. Dealers chase the wave. Builders leave behind blueprints. By the twilight of the 21st century's third decade, Frank Lucas had become more ghost than man, less an individual remembered for his face, and more a framework invoked when things ran too smoothly to be accidental. He no longer needed name recognition to be powerful. His methods had become muscle memory, embedded in the operational DNA of countless invisible systems, some criminal, some legal, and a handful that blurred the lines so well, not even regulators knew which side they sat on. Frank Lucas had never aimed to be a role model, but in every sharp mind that asked, how can I control more with less? In every risk-taker who chose routine over recklessness, he left fingerprints. In that sense, he hadn't died. He had simply been absorbed. Historical fact. Several Fortune 500 companies, in internal operations reports from the 2010s and 2020s, referenced distribution models with Lucas-level redundancy. The phrase didn't refer to Frank Lucas explicitly, but those who traced the lineage of that term knew the origin. It wasn't admiration, it was accuracy. Many people still think legacy comes from fame. So what do you think? Is legacy what they write on your grave? Or what survives in people who never speak your name? There's a story. Maybe real. Maybe one of Harlem's sleepy myths. A young man, bright, tech-savvy, but broke, builds a startup that grows faster than it should. Quiet funding, quiet expansion, limited faces, trusted cousins, a handful of warehouses. A journalist interviews him after his first major deal. How'd you learn how to scale so fast? And the young man, not smiling, simply says, I read more than I talked. No attribution, no specific source, but those who knew. That was the way Frank moved, not in slogans, in silence. He'd always understood that attention was the tax paid by amateurs. Real builders? They don't advertise their scaffolding. They just keep climbing. That same principle showed up again in a documentary that aired briefly on late-night cable in 2031. Titled The Blueprint in the Basement, it traced the architecture of modern supply chains from international import-export brokers to neighborhood dispensaries, back to techniques pioneered not in corporate boardrooms, but in Harlem brownstones. Frank's name was mentioned only once, but the episode ended with a shot of a sealed cardboard box, stored in a temperature-controlled archive, labeled in fading marker, Lucas, Original Ledger, 1971. The voiceover was simple, some designed with power, others with patience, the rarest built with both. The screen faded to black, and that was it. No cinematic score, no dramatic reenactments, just a man's system, still alive in a world that had forgotten who drew its first lines. Even in death, Frank had managed one last sleight of hand. He had stepped back far enough to become structure, not spectacle. Julie had once said, in her only public quote after his passing, people want heroes or monsters. They don't know what to do with someone who simply understood how things work. She wasn't wrong, because the scariest thing about Frank Lucas wasn't his past. It was how relevant it remained. In the age of smart surveillance, digital footprints, and global oversight, people still found new ways to study his discipline, still saw the value in slow growth, internal networks, and silence that said more than slogans. And so he lingers in risk analysis models, in the pacing of security briefings, in quiet strategy sessions where someone leans back and says, "Let's not rush. Let's Lucas this thing." No one needs to know who Frank was. The system remembers for them. It breathes, seamless and constant, behind storefronts, in spreadsheets, in the logic of efficiency whispered from one cautious mind to another. And that's the kind of immortality Frank Lucas always wanted. Not gold-plated, not headline-choked, but still working. Late in life, when the days began to fold in on each other, Frank Lucas once sat in a metal chair on a porch somewhere just outside Newark, watching the sun go down like it owed him something. He had no empire then, no runners, no meetings, just silence, a thin blanket over his knees, and a mind that still ticked like it was calculating something too complex to speak aloud. He didn't speak often anymore. Didn't need to. Not when the world had caught up to his thinking in ways even he hadn't expected. The corners were digitized now. The runners carried encrypted wallets instead of envelopes. But the core? Still the same. Control. Structure. Trust built on routine, not roar. If Frank felt bitter about it, he didn't show it. Because for a man who once trafficked in quiet, the idea that his ideas lived on, even without his name, felt like a kind of triumph. The system, after all, was never meant to be a monument. It was meant to work. Historical fact? In 2040, long after Frank had passed, a think tank on decentralized economic ecosystems released a report citing historical urban network models that influenced modern small cell distribution logistics. The earliest and most effective case? Frank Lucas's 1970s heroin grid in Harlem. Not praised, not romanticized, just acknowledged. And maybe that's all Frank ever wanted, to be understood without needing to be explained. Many people still think understanding a man like Frank means condoning him. So what do you think? Can you study the storm without asking for the thunder? One of the last people to see Frank alive was a nurse who checked on him twice a day. He never said much, but one day, as she helped him stand, he said something that stuck with her for years after. Everything breaks, even systems. The only question is, does it break when you're done using it or before? She asked if his broke too soon. Frank blinked slow, smiled once, and said, "Right on time." There's something satisfying in that. Not joyful, not tragic, just finished. He didn't need legacy banners, didn't need speeches or statues. His success had always been the infrastructure of silence. The fact that you could feel his hand in systems that denied ever knowing him. Now, long after his last breath, that hand still guides things, quietly. A line in a policy review, a whisper in a strategy meeting, a decision not to centralize too much, a ledger double-checked, and always a rhythm in the background. It doesn't march, it measures, because Frank Lucas didn't build a drug empire. He built a formula, and somewhere someone is still using it. So now we slow everything down. Let Harlem fade behind warm glass. Let the sun drop beneath low buildings. Let the names we spoke so often tonight return to quiet. Inhale once, deep and slow. Exhale, slower still. Let it all go now. Let the last siren of the evening trail off into memory. Let the corners empty. Let the night settle over the streets that once pulsed with something unspeakable. Because now, there's stillness. And that stillness is safe. The story is told, the math is done, the silence is earned, so rest now. You've heard the whole shape of the storm. You've watched the system tick, and all that's left is sleep. Sweet dreams.